whatever good time of the day it is for you. We now want to talk about the extraordinary story of the daughters of Slavhad. There's a man with this rather strange name, Slavhad. There seem to be too many consonants in that word, who dies leaving only daughters. He leaves 5 daughters and no sons. Now, this fact we already know, before we get into the story, we already know it from the preceding passage in chapter 26 of Sefer Bamidbar, of the book of Numbers, where the subject was a command, a divine command, to do a census of the people and to divide up the land according to the tribes, according to the leaders of the tribes, the leaders of the chieftains, of the sub-tribes. And there, among all the lists of names of the people, the leading names of the people, there is the name of Slavhad and the fact that he dies with leaving only daughters, and he didn't have a son. And nothing is made of it. It's clearly a problem because in every other case, it's the relation between father and son that gives title to land. And so what we have suddenly at the beginning of chapter 27, rather unexpectedly, is the word Vatikravna, that out of the whole mass of the people who have been neatly subdivided and divided and subdivided into groups and subgroups, and each one told what his piece of land is going to be, suddenly there are 5 women who come close, who draw near, that is, who move into the line of fire, I'll translate it like that, who come dangerously close. They move into an area that is not comfortable for them and perhaps not even appropriate for them. And that area is the area where the leading dignitaries of the people sit. And these women now daringly and with a strange sense of entitlement walk into that sanctum of the greatest of the greatest. They approach Vatikravna, Vatamodna. So the scene begins with 2 feminine plural words separated by a verse. They come close and they stand. I'll read the verses. If you have your book of Numbers in front of you, it's chapter 27, verse 1. Vatikravna b'not Slavhad, the daughters of Slavhad, who was the son of Hefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Menashe, of the family of Menashe, who was the son of Yosef. So suddenly there's a whole barrage of male names going back in time. This is the ancestry of these 5 women. And basically the ancestry goes back 5 fathers until we get to Menashe. And then his entitlement is also added in, that he is the son of Yosef. So there is that patrilineal line that stands behind these 5 women. We hear these 5 male names. That's their right to be here, included among the people. And these are the names of the daughters, of his daughters. Machala, Noah, Chogla, Milka, Betilza. And here we have these feminine names with no characterization of them. We don't know even who the leader is. It seems that it's a group. When I gave my title to this talk, I called it A Tale of 5 Sisters. That is, for a moment, we can glimpse them when they're named as 5 sisters. There are 5, there's a group here, a cluster, with no apparent differentiation. They don't seem to be very highly different from each other. It's just one name after the other on the one hand. And on the other hand, they're clearly not the same as each other because they have names. They are differentiated. And so we're not sure what is happening here. Suddenly a cluster of women who have behind them 5 generations of men, male names. And Vata'amodna, they draw near and they stand. They take up a position. It's a very unusual word to find in the feminine plural form. Actually, any word is rare to find in the Torah in this form of a ta'na. Yeah, Vata Amodna, Vatikravna. It's quite unusual. And so they stand there, they stand in the face of Moshe, in the face of Elazar, the priest, in the face of the princes, and the whole community, Ha'edah, which by definition is male, at the entrance to the tent of assembly. So before they've said a word, a narrative scene has been set, which speaks more than 1,000 words. That is 5 solitary women, I want to say. Yeah. Each one is her own person, but they come in a group of 5. They have 5 fathers behind them. And now they stand in front of, in descending order, groups of fearfully eminent men who are in charge of the law. And their purpose is to plead in law. They want to plead the case of female inheritance in this particular case. That's their charge. That's their mission now. And the next verse continues. It's an exquisite short story. Every word needs attention. Avinu met, right? They begin to speak, finally, after this scene setting, this narrative opening. Our father died in the wilderness. Now that's a dramatic statement, right? The poignant statement. But he wasn't among those part of the community who conspired against God in the story of Korach. He didn't belong to that rebellious community. So really, we're getting too much information here. All really the women need to say is, our father is dead. He didn't leave sons. We present our case, and really to start talking law on some level. But instead, they seem to get lost in thinking about their father. By association, he's dead. Oh, but he wasn't one of those dead, of the rebels. Ki b'chet omed, he died of his own personal sin. And we don't get to find out what sin. It's all a little obscure and in a way almost rambling. It's not, I don't want to use the word exactly, but there is a sense here of getting lost in language, which is what language does to you. Once you're really speaking, somewhere language pulls you in various directions. But then they get back to the point and they say, Uvanim lo hayulo, and he didn't have sons. And then finally, after this narrative opening, they get into their plea, their legal plea. Lama yigara shem avinu mitoch mishpachto. Why should the name of our father be diminished in the midst of his family? Right? There he is in the midst of his world, in the midst of his context. Why should he alone lose his name? Because he doesn't have a son. Tena lanu achuza betoch ache avinu. Give us possession in the midst of the brothers of our father. We are also in the midst, right? That is, the brothers of our father is losing his property in amongst them, but we stand in his place, as it were, now, and give us the property among the brothers who also share the property. And notice twice the reference to our father. Vayakrev Moshe et mishpatan lifnei Hashem. And Moshe brought their case into the presence of God. So again, the word to draw close, they drew close to him, and he now draws the case close to God. Moshe refers it upwards. They come and submit their case very briefly and very pungently, and he refers it onwards. Why does he not answer? It's one of the questions that arises. We'll have a look at Rashi and at other suggestions. And then we just go on to the next couple of verses. And then God said to Moshe, saying, Ken benot Slavhad dovrot. The famous and splendid response of God. Right? The law is brought down. But it doesn't come in the form of a law. It comes in the form of a narrative description. The daughters of Slavhad speak Ken. It's a really unusual way of saying what? They speak correctly. They've made a good case. I accept their case. That seems to be what is meant. But what is the force of the word Ken here? And the emphasis on how they speak. Really, in the end, what is the distinguishing feature of Benot Slavhad? That they are good speakers. And this in no trivial sense. I want to put a lot of weight on that expression. It carries a lot of weight. Kin dovrot. I would like to put it in the context, since we've been seeing things in context of the generations, in context of the ranks of power. Now the context is all the ways of speaking that we're being engaged with throughout Sefer Bamidbar. And we've seen even in the last 2 weeks, all the cases of misspeaking, cursing, blessing, and all the confusions, the murky projections that were involved in that ambivalence about cursing and blessing. He means to curse, but actually he blesses. And then the Midrash comes and says, you can trace the shadow of the curse in the very words of blessing. So there's something disordered about that. Disorderly speech. Before we had Moshe not speaking to the rock, but hitting the rock. And now finally, it's as if God says, yes, right? I'm being a little whimsical here. Ken. Finally, someone is speaking well. Someone is speaking, actually, at this moment. Ken dovrot. And the book of Bamidbar, which is all about the wilderness, is also all about medaber. It's a classic play on words, which I enjoy, and I think it's got a lot of depth to it. That the wilderness was the place in which there was full play given to the possibilities of speech. Malicious speech, loving speech, misspeaking, hateful, all kinds of speech. And finally, good speech. Kin dovrot. And then God pronounces the law, you shall give them a possession, inheritance in the midst of the brothers of their father, and you shall transfer the property of their father, the inheritance of their father, to them. And that's where we stop our short story. Let's have a look at Rashi. Let's see what Rashi does with this. The women's plea, number 1 on your page. The women's plea. Why should the name of our father be diminished? Now, that is a plea beginning with the word lama. Why? It's not an academic why. They're not asking for information. It's clearly that form of speech that we call a rhetorical question. What you mean when you say, why should such be the case, is, I don't think it should be the case. That lama contains a strong negative undertone. It's out of the question that this should be the case. So it's a lama that contains in itself a law. Shouldn't be the case. What is going to be in the future, our father is going to lose his name because he won't have land to be named after him. That is, it's not conceivable. And then follows, in Rashi's terms, the women's clever legal plea, which we don't get in the text of the Torah. Suddenly these women become scholars, and we understand that they are chachamot, as the Midrash calls them. We'll see it soon. That they are not just any woman, but they are wise women. They are well-informed women. They are women. We'll see what some of the implications of that. We stand in the place of a son. That's their assertion. And if women, females, are not counted as a zera, as seed for inheritance, inheritance goes to seed, and seed is not a female category, then in that case, our mother should have relations with her husband's brother, it's called yibum, and produce more children, if that's possible, so that the father doesn't lose his name. In other words, what Rashi is doing here is creating a legal plea based, of course, from Talmudic sources, it's traditional sources, which makes their claim reasonable. It's not really a feminist claim. It's a claim on the basis of fairness, of rightness, and then a kind of outrageous mental exercise. So then the mother should marry again, and some extraordinary measure we should have resort to, which is by way of saying, here we are. Why don't you accept us as being in the same place? We fill the same space for this purpose as sons. Next line there, for he didn't have a son, leaving about the father. If he had had a son, we shouldn't have demanded anything. This teaches us that they were chochmaniot, which is a version of chachamot, which almost makes it sound like a professional guild. They're chochmaniot. They were clever women. You can recognize them by the way they speak, that they understand what a reasonable claim is and what it isn't, and they wouldn't have asked. In other words, they're saying, as women often said when I was young, we are not feminists, defensively. I don't think I actually ever said that. I hope I never said that. But feminist was dubious. It's clear. And we're not here to plead the rights of women. We are here to plead the name of our Father, which you can't get a more patrilineal, patriarchal concern than the concern for the name of the Father. That's what gives meaning and coherence and reality to our family and ultimately to our people and to our hold on the land. And so obviously we're only claiming because there is no son. So it's an emergency claim. They frame it that way, according to Rashi. Moshe brought their claim to God. Why? They came to him, and he has a whole cohort of people, distinguished people around him who could come to grips with it. Why does he take it to God? Because the law became invisible to him, I want to say. Suddenly, perhaps it was suddenly, there's a kind of blackout. And this is something that happens to Moshe in Midrashic readings more than once throughout the Torah. When Moshe is in tension, when he has some kind of anger in him, anger is always the underlying issue with Moshe, then he forgets. He forgets what he knew, what he might have otherwise known. And suddenly the law disappears from his view. Nit al-Maid was hidden. And in that way, he was punished for being a little too natal atara. He took the crown for himself, a little bit too self-focused on the occasion when he said to the people, when they're setting up all kinds of hierarchies of courts, legal courts, the difficult issues bring to me. If something's too difficult for you, bring it to me. And suddenly this is judged, this is sensed as being a little too egotistical. And the punishment is this very internal, subtle punishment of suddenly not being able to answer a question that you should have been able to answer. So it's a strangely personal, idiosyncratic moment, which means he has to take the case to God. As we will see, there are other explanations given. I think I'll wait till we read through Rashi and then we'll come to them. Davar acher, here's another possibility. Ru'uya hayita parsha zul yikatev al yedei Moshe. This whole episode, parsha, was worthy to have been written through the hands of Moshe. Moshe should have been the author of this episode. Now, what do we mean by author? It isn't Moshe who makes up the Torah, who invents the Torah according to traditional understanding. It's God who writes the Torah. It's written by the mind of God, but Moshe is his instrument. Moshe is it would be al yedei. In other words, what should have happened properly, ru'uya, it would have been appropriate that Moshe should deliver the law, that he should answer the question, the legal question. And then the law would have been to his credit. And it would be, as it were, that he's the author of the law. We want to come back to this question of authorship. What does it mean to be an author in this way? But what happened in this case? Ela shezachu b'not Slavhad v'nichtava al yadan. But the daughters of Slavhad merited to have it written through them. It sounds by their hand. It sounds as if they actually wrote the law. They wrote this story. No, not exactly that, perhaps, but that the story happened and was written down by their agency because they brought the case up. They are the ones who articulate the case, and Moshe fails to answer it. So in the end, they are the human progenitors. They are the ones who generate this whole story. They get full credit for the story. Ken b'not Slavhad, they speak well. Rashi translates this into Aramaic, ya'ut, which means kach, fittingly, so, just right. Ken means fitting to something else. Kamo, with either ken, the approximate. Kamoma, they speak in a way that's appropriate to something else. That's the force of the word ken here, as Rashi translates it. Appropriate to what? This episode is like what? Kach ktuva parshazu lefanai b'maron. Exactly so, this episode is written before me, God says, in my heavenly courts. Up there, that's exactly the way the plea, the law goes, starting with that position. The law is exactly the way they say it. And so this teaches us, Magid, Shira'ata inan ma shelo ra'ata ino shel Moshe. Wonderful, Rashi, based on the Talmud. This tells you that their eye saw what Moshe's eye failed to see. It's a failure of vision. Moshe, it's not just that he didn't remember, it's that it disappeared from his field of reality. He couldn't see it, and they can see it. And there's the emphasis on the eye here. And they are getting a lot of credit now. But it's not just that they're clever speakers. They make a clever case in law. They have a true instinct. Ken comes to mean something like true. And yet, ken is a very interesting double word, and I want to make something of this. That word ya'ut, which means fitting, harmonious, appropriate, really means beautiful. It has the idea of ya'eh. It's one of the senses of beauty. And if you look in the next line, you'll see again a reference to beauty, yafeh tavu. They have made their claim yafeh. Now, yafeh could mean beautifully, elegantly, succinctly. They've done it very finely. They've done it justly. They've done it nicely, precisely. Yafeh has all these, and then we finish here. And then suddenly, Ashrei Adam, happy is the human being to whose words God gives assent. That God himself says the word ken. He says, that's beautiful. That there's a kind of aesthetic, ethical. I want to put the two things together. Let's start with aesthetic. Your eye sees, usually what your eye sees is beauty. That's what the eye appreciates. That's the basic meaning. The eye seeing can also be an intellectual thing, that you get it. But basically, it has to do with beauty, yafeh. And beauty is the basic translation for yafeh. And here then, suddenly, there's a lyrical outburst from Rashi, which is quite different from just translating the text into other language. Ashrei Adam, happy is the human being. And suddenly we're not talking about men or about women, about sons and daughters. We're talking about a human being. Happy is the human being to whose words God pays assent, gives assent. He acknowledges and says, ken. So suddenly, what is Rashi actually saying here? He's giving divine force to the word ken. He's saying when God says ken, he is saying that he is saying, God is saying himself, I account happy anyone to whose words are corroborated by God. Who else could be speaking? Who is saying Ashrei Adam? Who's coming out with this sudden lyrical outburst? You could say, well, it's Rashi. Rashi is the one who is suddenly moved to poetry, to lyricism, and to say, what a happy condition to have God say ken to you, which undoubtedly is true. But how does that help us? All right, so God said it to the women, and all right, and so they're happy. So here's a kind of imaginative movement on the part of Rashi and part of the writer of these words. In other some midrashic sources, these words are attributed to the nations of the world as a token of how much Israel at certain moments is appreciated and admired even by the nations of the world. Happy is the human being, as if the nations of the world value this. So there's a whole range of possibilities about who is speaking it. But basically, it's Rashi. Rashi is the one who suddenly bursts into poetry, and he says, Ashrei. And what is ashrei? It's not a description. And I want to be spending some time on the word ashrei. It's a way of, it's another way of talking about ken. That there is a fine-tuned creativity in the way the women have been speaking. And God simply says ken to it. That's exactly what I had written before me. And I think of the aesthetic and the ethical sort of a meeting. I'm thinking, for instance, of the word fair in English. It's something is fair, it's beautiful. Something is fair, it's just. And God is saying both they speak justly and they speak beautifully, fairly. That is a fair, that's a very, yes, perhaps we don't use that, a fair maid, right? A slightly old-fashioned use of the word fair. The American philosopher Elaine Scarry has a beautiful book called On Beauty, very well worth reading if you're interested in this kind of philosophical inquiry, in which she talks about the function of beauty, the great value of beauty. And of course, she's talking in a generation when beauty is not considered of great value when talking about serious matters. The aesthetic is not a high value in the mid-late 20th century. And she is saying here that beauty has an ethical value. There is a place where the two meet. That's it's an unusual claim. And she tries to make it real. She tries to express it and make it real by saying that beauty, where you don't see the justice of an issue, sometimes it can help. Simply to see something beautiful, harmonious, well distributed. What is the nature of beauty? It's that it's symmetrical. That's one of the attributes of beauty. It's distributed well to all sides. So that's what we call fair. And that leads you then to broaden your expectations in the real world as well. You're looking for that kind of fairness of distribution in the resources of the world as well, even perhaps when it comes to inheritance. The word fair, she points out, comes from a root cluster in European languages, in Old English, Old Norse, and two cognate roots in East European languages and in Sanskrit. So it's not just a play on words. Fair actually has that double meaning in all these original languages. The idea of symmetry, equality in all directions, a kind of generosity about how you see things. Tolstoy apparently began his day every day by sweeping the floor. That was because of his passion for social justice. In some way, it marries with a concern for social justice, marries with sweeping his floor and making sure that all is fair and evenly spread out. And he quotes also Aristotle, who says that justice is like a perfect cube. Again, perfectly symmetrical in all directions. And Iris Murdoch, who says that the effect of beauty is to unself the viewer. Beautiful, but unselfing. It takes you beyond yourself. You see yourself now as part of a world. And the world, now you see that it's a world of beauty. It's a world in which things relate to each other. They are harmonious with each other. So you don't think about yourself so exclusively when you're involved in the world of beauty. Now, that whole little excursion about beauty leads me to think of the statement, the ultimate statement of the Benot Slavhad, the daughters of Slavhad, seeing right where Moshe didn't see right, that they have a better sense of the aesthetic, ethical, which makes an invidious comparison with Moshe. So what Rashi is doing, perhaps it's a little painful to read, it must have been painful for Moshe to experience, is it's a kind of value judgment based on the comparison of Benot Slavhad and Moshe. And Moshe comes off the worse for it. That they actually are the ones who are given credit as against him. And so it seems to me that not only in this Rashi, but in many Midrashic sources, I'll quote one or two more, A tension is set up implicitly between Moshe and Bnot Slavhad. It's not just a neutral matter. They present a case and God decides the case. Moshe is in the middle there and he can't do it. There's a failure there. He fails to answer the case. Why? Another suggestion by the Zohar. Perhaps because, it's an interesting suggestion, Moshe recuses himself from the case. He abstains from judgment. He removes himself from the roster because he's afraid that people might think he has a personal resentment against this family, that perhaps they were, after all, among the rebellious agents of the past. And there are various suggestions about who they might have been involved with. In other words, Moshe, on the merest whisper in his mind of any kind of prejudice against this family, recuses himself from the case. Now, that serves to tell us that the air, the atmosphere in which legal cases are judged by human beings is full of possibilities of prejudice, resentment, loss, invidious comparisons. It's full of personal issues and political issues. And Moshe wants to avoid running foul of any of that, and so he withdraws from the case. These women, when they come close, when they draw near, are drawing near into that field, right? A field in which legal issues and other ethical issues and issues of personal relationships and of implications of all kinds are entangled with each other. That's the nature of a field. Not because this was an unjust court, but that's the nature of human structures. And in that sense, I want to read a definition from the Oxford Science Dictionary of what a field is in this meaning of the word. A field is a region in which a body experiences a force as a result of the presence of some other body or bodies. That is, there's a sense of the impact of the presence of others, even without anything being said. In some way, it impinges on you. You aren't neutral. You're not cut off. You're within a field. And therefore, here's the dictionary continues. It's a method of representing the way in which bodies are able to influence each other, the subtle influences that people can have on one another without actually saying blatant things. And that is the nature of human call to judgment. And Moshe, according to the Zohar, recognizes this and prefers to send the case to the higher court, to God himself. But this tension that exists between Moshe and the daughters of Slavhad is emphasized in more than one midrash. And I want to emphasize one midrash particularly, which is this. Hadin, this God says to Moshe, Hadin she'en ata yodea hanashim danin oto. It's not enough that their eye sees what you can't see, but this even stronger way of putting it, the law that you don't know is being adjudicated, is being discussed rightly by women. The contrast, the tension between Moshe and women, which sets up a gender issue. Yeah. Now, of course, we'd like to believe that a good judge is above such things, and certainly Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm a little hesitant, it's clearly that I'm trying to say that even Moshe is bound to have been affected by God's way of putting things in this midrash. Even women know it. Right? Clearly there is that sarcasm. Women and you don't know it, and even women know it. And there is a sense there somewhere of Moshe failing, of Moshe losing his grip. Right? This is the time when even women are taking over. Right? You are moving off screen, off scene. And one more such midrashic source, a rather strange one. The expression is often used, hifli mimenu, The case was too difficult for him. It was hidden from him. His strength ebbed when he realized that he couldn't judge the case. But then there's one specific issue that is highlighted, and that is that Moshe is somewhere reproached in case he was feeling any pride in the fact, you remember the story of Miriam and Zipporah, the fact that Moshe was not living with his wife. It's a rather fraught issue, that he had become celibate from the time of the revelation. He had separated from his wife, and under the command of God, just in case you were taking too much credit for it, Moshe is being told in this Midrash, notice that these women, what we are going to learn about them is that they will not marry anyone who is unworthy of them. And that acts to their credit. They're willing to remain unpartnered if they can't find the right person, if they can't find someone who's worthy. And they were not commanded. So don't think too much of yourself. So in a way, the very existence of the women in their single state, in this view, is a kind of reproach to Moshe, or a way of bringing him off his pedestal a little. Now, tension between Moshe and Bnot Slavhad. So where do we go from there? Two midrashic sources follow on your page, which we'll look at together now. Number 2. Vatikravna Bnot Slavhad. These daughters of Slavhad drew close. Gedula lahen u'gedula la'avihen. This is greatness, distinction for them and distinction for their father. Distinction for Machir, distinction for Yosef, going back through the generations, all the fathers. What is the distinction that comes to them? Shekach yatzu minenu nashim, that such women have come of them. Chachamat v'tzidkaniot, wise and righteous. Tzidkaniot in that form again, chachmaniot, tzidkaniot. And the third compliment that is classically given to the women, but not here, is darshaniot, who know how to make a drasha, who know how to expound the text, who know how to interpret the text, which is a rather extraordinary compliment to give to women. That's one of the characteristics of these women. This is what they know how to do. The other two compliments, chachamot with tzidkaniot, it becomes a compliment to their fathers for having fathered such amazing women, that these are such distinguished. So what you have is a kind of mutual complementary society here. I haven't quite got the phrase, where the daughters take glory, take honor in who their parents are, and the parents take honor in who their children are. Only it just so happens that the children are women in this case, which doesn't seem to make any difference, right? It's a way of non-gendering, of saying the issue here has nothing to do with gender in this midrash. It's kind of the normal, proper state in which it isn't only the great ancestors that we glory in, but they glory in us as well, which is a less obvious thing to say. And so, question is, what was the wisdom of these women? Shelefi sha'a dibru, that they spoke appropriately with appropriate timing. They had a very good sense of timing. Because what was Moshe doing at the time that he drew near to the court? He was busy dealing with the issue of inheritances, as we just read in the previous passages. If you go back before this story, that's been the whole issue of inheritances. They were dividing up among the tribes. So they are engaged in that very issue. So the women come at a very opportune moment. They don't come and just, like a bull in a china shop and say, oh, we have this issue about our father and inheritance. They choose their moment very well. And for that reason, they are called wise. Wise then would mean, having a good sense of timing means a sense of appropriateness, a canny sense of reality. How are you going to speak? You're going to speak at a moment when you will be heard. You'll listen before you speak. I'm doing my best for this thesis because I'm going to actually be overriding it very shortly. Right? It's a kind of canny and even, you might say, political way of working. That before they make their claim, they make sure that there's a listening ear. That this is a good moment, as we say. And in that sense, they are chachamot. And then another example is given, which we've already met, of how wise they were. The argument that they make that if there were a son, we would say that if we are not considered like children, then let our mother perform yibum, and so on. And then immediately Moshe drew the case close to God. So it's an issue of good timing, lefi sha'ah. But look now at the next midrash. It's not in English, unfortunately. Yalkut Shimoni. These women arose, umdim. That's the word. They stood. They stood there for something. They stood there against something, in the face of something. Right? The many meanings of to stand your ground. They stood there in the generation of the wilderness. And they merited to take the reward of everybody else, of all those who failed in the wilderness. Why? Generation of the wilderness is the generation of the spies. It's those 40 years. Well, we know that. This is within those 40 years, but a very precise point is being made here about how they speak. This teaches you, be'ez sha'ah amdu lifnei Moshe. This teaches you at what moment they stood up in front of Moshe. B'sha'ah, an hour, at what hour? But clearly it doesn't mean the time of the day. It's a moment, as we say. At what historical moment they rose up and stood there? At the moment when Israel were saying, at that very same moment, Israel were saying, let us appoint another leader and go back to Egypt. Now that's the story of the spies. At the moment that the spies rebelled in that way, these women are saying something very different. Of course, we have a question here. This is not exactly that moment. This is 38 years later. Moshe said to them, Moshe himself is surprised at them. It's not an appropriate moment. Moshe finds it rather strange. And he says to them, Halo Yisrael mevakshin lachzor leMitzrayim. Israel, the people of Israel, are just looking to return to Egypt. That's all they seem to want in life. They're constantly wanting to return to Egypt. And you want the same word. You are looking for an inheritance in the land. Where are you coming from? Don't you understand the zeitgeist? Don't you have a feeling for where reality is now? The reality in the people is that everyone wants to go back to Egypt. How come? It's a really almost a kind of inappropriateness in the way he asks the question. You're like, oh, you are strange. What is this? And they answer quite calmly, but we know that in the end, at another historical moment, the whole people will hold on to their share in the land. That is, all right, the fashion now is not to want a share in the land, but really real desire is to go back to Egypt. And we alone stand for the eventual desire. We know that ultimately, when things settle down, then the people will settle and will hold on to their share in the land. Things will change. Shenemar, what's the principle that moves them to say this? Et lasot laHashem heferu toratecha, which is a classic rabbinical principle. It's a time, a moment to act for God, timing. What is the time to act for God? When no one else is, when the Torah is being broken. That is, when everyone else is speaking a different language. And I think if I put it like that, it becomes stronger. It's not just when everyone else was sinning by wanting to run back to Egypt. It's when there was a different current language. There's an idiom filling the atmosphere. You can't talk outside that idiom and be believed. And here they come and speak a different language, which is a language of acting for God. It's a language that acts. It's what's called a performative act of language. It's not just they're saying something when they present their legal case. They're creating a reality. They're creating the reality of the law at that moment. I don't know if I should go into that. It's a wonderful reversal of the terms here. The idea basically is, when is the time to act for God? When is it meaningful to act for God? When is it, right? When is it significant ethically, spiritually, and even in terms of chokhmah, right? It doesn't undermine their chokhmah. It's to say something at a time when no one can hear it. Of course, the hope here is that Moshe will be able to hear it, and of course, Moshe hears it. But Moshe is marveling at the untimeliness of the whole thing. What is going on here? And so what we have then is a discourse of inheritances, which is in their mouths and in the mouths of Moshe as he's apportioning the land, but there's nowhere else in the people. What is the sha'ah, the moment? The moment is the moment of the Meraglim, even though it's 38 years later. It's still their moment. Now that's quite a damning statement, that in the people deep down, right, there's an undercurrent of still hankering for Egypt, right? And we see it almost to the last minute. Right? It changes form slightly, but you can't say there's a massive expressed desire to go into the land on the whole by the people. And so really they are talking, the women are talking now in an unpropitious time, and that's to their credit. That's exactly why they're considered great, according to this understanding. I want to read a passage from Emerson here. Emerson in a very famous essay called Self-Reliance. Man is timid and apologetic. He is letting his contemporaries have it. He is no longer upright. He does not say, I think, I am, but quotes some saint or sage. He is ashamed before the blade of grass or the blowing rose. They are what they are. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. Man is timid and apologetic. He is criticizing the human posture of people in his generation, how they stand, that they can't stand upright and say, I am. Or otherwise understood, that whatever they say with a sense of I am. Well, it's a very dangerous statement. It's very difficult words to say. I am. In face of everything, I am. And they don't have that posture. They have very poor posture. And to stay with it. And the women who come in our story, vata'amodna, they stand there in the presence of. And clearly, you know, if Emerson had known of this way of thinking, and he would have engaged with this as an example. The contemporary philosopher Stanley Cavell says this. It's a wonderful sentence. He's discussing, actually, Emerson in this statement. No one comes is a tragedy for a child. If no one, here I am all alone, it's a tragedy for a child. For a grown-up, it means that the time has come to be the one who goes first. If no one comes, for an adult, it means that the time has come. Someone else hasn't come, but the time has come for me to be first. Now that's a reframing with a vengeance. And it's a way of distinguishing between child and adult. It's a question of maturity. It's a question of growing into something, allowing oneself to be known, to be intelligible, that I will say what I have to say without any guarantee that you will understand me, but I will try to be intelligible with all the danger in this climate of what that involves. Right? That's Cavell's take on this. And Emerson is really talking in this essay about a moment of change, a moment in which one becomes, the soul becomes. The soul is not born who it will be. The soul is born, it's born, however it's born, but its task is to become and become and become. And becomings are ways of moving away from an original state. And this is Cavell and Emerson, an original state of what he calls uncreatedness. That one's original state is, in a sense, one in which I have not really been created. Perhaps I don't really exist until I actually say the words in one form or another, I am. How to prove that one exists? It's an ancient philosophical problem. Descartes famously, what did he say? Cogito ergo sum. I think, and therefore I am. I am in the body, I'm not at all sure of. The body is too treacherous. The body lets me down in all kinds of ways. I slip up. It's a slippery business, the body. It takes me into all kinds of dependencies and passions and entanglements. It's a muddy area. In the words of Descartes, find them. Descartes. I can't find what I'm looking for, but maybe it'll. One moment. Okay, the idea is that what Descartes says is the fear of madness, of not being able to know anything about oneself, and the idea that thinking is one's fortress of being. That's how one knows one is, because one thinks. Emerson plays off that. And he says, no, it's not thinking that does it. It's not the mind that does it. It's speaking. Saying, I think, I am. It's moving it backwards. It's the individual declaring, affirming, acknowledging that I really am. And however that is said, it can be said in all kinds of different ways. It can be said by the question, why should the name of our Father be diminished? That is a way of plotting one's existence into the world, of standing into the world. Eit lasot Lashem. A few lines further in that same midrash, in number 3, I didn't put it on your page, is that famous rabbinic statement, the makom she'ein gever, hishtadel liyot gever. In a place where there is no man, try to be a man. Now, you say it in the context of the story of Slavhad, and it's really almost irresistibly funny. There's something very, very interesting and very joyful about it. We're talking about 5 women, and we're saying these women teach us that in a place where there is no gever, hishtadel, which means a kind of struggle. Hishtadel is not just try. It means become. Try to become a gever. And so that gever, which seems so very gendered and so inappropriate at first sight to use to describe these women, loses its gendered quality and becomes a human quality. It's gever, gvura, to have that kind of inner strength that puts aside the destructive, skeptical voices and has the courage to stand in a place and to make a declaration which in a way creates a different reality. Because it's always possible at first, says Emerson, says Cavell, that I do not exist. That's the great dread, that's the great fear. It's the fear of a kind of getting lost in the mud, getting lost, drowning in deep waters. That's Descartes. So I affirm. And I affirm not as a mind, but as a speaking body. The mind for Descartes is called res cogitans, the thinking thing. That thinking thing in me, that's my mind. It's not part of my body. Whereas in rabbinic thought, the characteristic of a human being is the body, the speaking body. Because speech comes out of a body as well as out of a mind. Right? Speech is that which combines the two. But the body is obviously very important. And the body is prone to all kinds of adventures and escapades and failures and fiascos. And so that when we get real speech, we also get the risk of falling flat in your face. As someone who had a fall this week, I can testify that it's not pleasant. But it did help me think about Benot Slavhad. The whole question now of what is it really to speak? Speech is the important thing. In some way, there was a failure of speech in the last 2 weeks that we looked at, the issues that we looked at with Moshe at the rock and with Bilam. There are great misspeakings there. And in the end, now we come to Benot Slavhad, and God says, Ken, yes, at last, solid, verified, konen. What is konen is to put something solidly in place and to make it a reality. The word ashrei, happy is the human being with whom God's words agree, with whose words God agrees. That ashrei also has the implication of, right, what kind of speech is that? When you say happy is the man who, happy, for instance, I have a number of examples here. Ashrei, they're all paradoxical. Let's just take ours to start with. Happy is the human being to whose words God assents. Is that a description? It's a way of saying, oh, I'm looking at this human being and I'm seeing they really look happy. No. It's an exclamation point after it. Happy is the person who is a way of saying, I am saying it. The person, the speaker, is creating a situation. Someone has had this experience of having God agree with him, her, and I say now, in a kind of lyrical outburst, I say, oh, that's happiness. That is my understanding of the situation I am now putting out there in the world in words. And I want you to believe it. So I'm really using language as doing something, not just as saying something. This is the classic difference that the 20th century philosopher J.L. Austin worked with. He talked about the performative use of language, that you can use language to perform reality, to create a field in which you know how to move. This is my field now. It's a field in which I can learn how to move around. And in that sense, what you have now is the ashrei mode used in a situation which is actually very slippery and not very well-founded. How are these women to know that God agrees with their words if God doesn't tell them? This is the one time in human history where people were actually told, Ken, absolutely right, absolutely beautiful. But the statement here is happy is the human being, as if this is something we can all experience. And you know, dear reader, dear listener, you know what happiness is for you. If you have the experience of God agreeing with your words, well, if we take a maximum reading of that, that's never going to happen. We don't expect to hear voices of God saying ditto. I absolutely agree. And so what could it mean for the average reader? What would be a situation in which you know that God agrees? When you've gone out on a limb and taken the risk of saying something, of expressing also a performative opinion. Ashrei. Have a look now at the sources, the use of the word ashrei and what ashrei does. Soon after, earlier than this, yes, number 6a. God said to Moshe, Kach et Aaron, take Aaron and take him up to the top of the mountain where he will die. Now, how do you take a person to his death? What does take mean? Rashi wants to understand. It's a very, very focused reading, very beautiful. And Rashi does this many times on the word to take, an innocent word to take, which apparently should mean you take them by the hand and you take them by bodily, where you want to go. No, you can't take a person that way. You can take a thing that way. You can't take a person that way. So what does take mean? B'divrei nichumim, with words of comfort. A certain way of speaking will get him up the mountain, will bring him up the mountain. What is that way of speaking? Say to him, Ashrecha, happy are you. I am painting you as happy. I am celebrating your happiness. Why? I'm going to die. What happiness is that? It's highly paradoxical. But happy are you that you will see your crown placed on your son's head, which I will never merit. In other words, a certain laser beam into reality. The larger reality is that Aaron is going to die. But maybe I should say the immediate reality is that he's going to die. But the larger reality is that his children will inherit him, that he will pass on his legacy, as we say, to his children. And Moshe sharpens the felicity of this, how wonderful this is, by simply saying, I don't have that happiness. That Moshe's children don't inherit him in that sense. They don't pick up his mantle in the way that Aaron's children do. So what he's doing is he's trying to make Aaron recognize and affirm what he is affirming. See it my way. So it's a kind of persuasive use of language that tries to shift the lights and shadows. Austin, in writing about performative language, gives the main example he gives, I think one of the main examples is of the celebration of a marriage. That when certain words are said in a marriage, like I do thee wed, right, in the non-Jewish, right, or Harei at Mekudeshet, we're not describing what's happening, and we're not telling something to, we know it's not a command, we are performing it. In other words, when I've said those words, the marriage is in place. You've created the marriage. Harei at Mekudeshet, that's it. You don't have to do anything else. Putting the ring on the finger, but the words do it. So in that sense of the performative, Austin has a very nice, very singular image. He says it's like a miner's lamp, you know, a helmet that someone who, a miner, goes down into the dark with a lamp fixed into the helmet. What is the point of that? That it's limited illumination. It's very limited. It's lights and shadows. You see some things very strongly, other things not at all. It's the way of seeing and of knowing which is not based on absolute truth. It's based instead on a personal perspective, on the play of the light and the shadow, and the way in which one looks at the world as a result of that. And I want to say that's the use of the word ashrei, like a miner's lamp. It shifts the ground of happiness. You may have thought happiness is X, Y, and Z. No, I tell you, happiness is this, even though it's a rather unlikely thing, which you might never have used the word about. Even as it's everywhere in Psalms, as you know. I'll quote a couple of famous examples. Very first Psalm, very beginning of the first Psalm, Ashrei ha'esh asher lo halach ba'atzat rishayim. Happy is the human being who has not gone in the ways of the wicked. That's happiness. You know, that is, if so long as I haven't gone in the ways of the wicked, it's like, what is that? That is a light beam from the psalmist into a peculiar way of looking at reality. Yes, that's happiness. You know, I'm trying to make it happiness for you by my enthusiasm, by pointing it out to you. Or another very strange one, Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. Happy is the human being who is always afraid, who fears constantly. Right? We don't immediately assent to that and say, oh, yes, you're describing a reality we all recognize. The reality you are describing are one that I don't want. What, to go around being afraid all the time? But what happens here is that the psalmist is trying to put out into the world a different view of happiness. What does it mean to be afraid always? It means in some way to be aware, to be, right? You have to find a meaning now from a fached tamid in order to create the reality of ashrei, of happy is the human being. And I think every use of the word ashrei has that slightly paradoxical focus. It's a feeling somewhere of, I'm saying it's solid. What is ashrei? From the word ashurai, my steps, my solid footsteps, right? To be well based, to feel firm, to feel well placed, Right? That is part of the meaning of Ashra, that kind of happiness. And the interesting thing is, it often goes to describe situations that are slippery, that are not so secure. Psalm 40. David praises God, who has brought me up from a muddy pit, from the miry clay, from a very slippery place. Vayakem al sela raglai, he has placed upon a rock my foot. Konen ashurai, he plants my foot, my step firmly. There is konen and ashurai, right? Konen with ken and ashurai ashre. Right? That God creates happiness out of great insecurity. And he puts in my mouth a new song. There is the psalmist describing his work as someone who is constantly writing Ashrei. Right? Happy is, and then an unexpected correlative. In a world of insecurity and of uncertainty, there is a possibility of Ashrei, but it depends on an act of speech. How? And then I want to share with you some quotations that I found in a wonderful book by Shoshana Fellman, it's called The Speaking Body, in which he talks about this whole issue of the performative, of how language can create realities. And here are a number of quotations from different writers that talk about the possibility of slipping and falling. As soon as you open your mouth, your foot slips. There's something slippery. Here's Kierkegaard, who says this: vainly do I strive against it. I feel myself falling. My foot slips. My life is still a poet's existence. What a strange conclusion. That's the Ashrei. Happy am I that I can still slip, that I can still in some way not be afraid of slipping, that I can slip into discoveries, that I can slip into poetry, that I can slip into humor. Unexpected things come up in me, and I allow myself to slip. I'm not so rigid that I prevent myself from slipping. Now, here you have, it's a tension between grim reality and a certain strange elation in being someone who's capable of working, playing with, right, with the interplay of things. That is opening oneself to what I'll call stumbling misfires. If it works, it'll be happy, right? If I say Harei at B'Kudeshet, or someone says Harei at B'Kudeshet, in the right circumstances and to the right woman, then that will be a happy arrangement. But if you say it in the wrong situation, if you say it because you're half asleep and you don't, right, and you say the words not exactly right, it's a misfire. It's what we call a misfire. That is, you fail to achieve what you wanted. And that failure in achieving what you wanted, Shoshana Fellman says, thinking about the whole performative issue, she says it's an inherent capacity of the performative. Whenever you have the courage to say something in a way that wants to shape reality, even the words I am, then you risk slippage. You risk misfire. Taking the risk means that there is a risk. Real speech takes risks. The speech that takes no risks is not the kind of speech of which God says, Ken, Dovrot. There are those who know about that becoming, which is speaking. Here is Baudelaire, talking of poetry. He talks of stumbling over words like cobblestones. Who else do I have here? Yes. Austin himself. We are floundering here. He says about his own way of thinking. He says he's writing. He says, oh, we are floundering here. Sounds bad. Don't you want your philosopher to be clear, to be solid? We are floundering here. The firm ground of prejudice is slipping away. The firm ground of knowing exactly what you think before you speak is slipping away, and that's exhilarating. It's unnerving and it's exhilarating to have nothing solid to stand on and to create something solid out of the insecurity because of a certain vision of things, because of a way of seeing, yes? So the human aptitude for fiasco, right? That's Austin's argument, that we are very prone to falling on our faces. Chazal say it too. In one of the most powerful paradoxical statements that I know about slipping and falling and many other things. This is from the Gemara in Gittin, Mem Gimel. Ein Adam omed al divrei Torah, ela im kein nichshal behem. A person doesn't get to stand firmly, stably, upon words of Torah, which means to understand them, to get it firmly, unless he has stumbled over them. There is no standing without stumbling, or without the risk of stumbling. If you're holding on tight on all sides, you're not really standing. If you're quoting someone else rather than trying to say something yourself, then again, that's Emerson's example, then in some way you are failing to say, right? You're too embarrassed to say, I am. And I am, in rabbinic terms, what Chazal want to say is that the only way of really understanding anything worth understanding is by having launched out a little beyond your total confidence and security and certainty. To say something that is forming itself as you are speaking, which is very scary business. So slippage is part of the act of speech, or creating something out there in reality. In the end, before Moshe leaves the people, the last thing he says to them, almost one of his most significant last addresses to them, is Ashrecha Yisrael. Happy are you, O Israel. Oh, the happiness of you. It's like, again, he bursts into that exclamation mark. What's the happiness, after all? Their leader is leaving them. It's not such a happy situation. They're being left with a new, untried leader, and they're just about to go into Eretz Yisrael, and everything is new and unknown. Right? You could say it's not exactly a solid, stable situation. And here is Moshe, lyrically praising their happiness. Mi kamocha am nosha b'Hashem. Who is like you? You are a people saved by God. God is your savior. In other words, it's true, there's no one else. And there's only God, right? Is that bad news or good news? You might think it's bad news. I think it's good news, Moshe is saying. You are a people purely saved by God. And Rashi says on this rather wonderfully, after all the descriptions in the text before of various blessings, right? Various blessings given to the people. In the end, Rashi says, Ashrecha Yisrael. What is it? You are happy. Happy are you? Klal davar. The general sum total of your situation is Hakol Shalachem. Everything is yours. Everything is yours. The sum total is, it's not particular blessings here and there. You have this blessing, but not that blessing. You have everything, because there is a moment in which whatever there is becomes everything. It's a question of perspective. It's a question of, is it ashrei for me somewhere? Can I hear what's involved in that ashrei? Something that goes beyond the obvious solid foundations of things. Paul Celan, the great Holocaust poet, has one poem called Ashrei. He occasionally brought in Hebrew words into his German text. He was the poet who insisted on writing in German, which was the language in which his mother was murdered. John Felstener's, that's John Felstener's sentence. He has written a very good book on Paul Celan, biography and an interpretive biography. And what we have here then is a poem with a Hebrew word in it that the German reader can't understand. Right? It's a word to slip on. So what is that? I don't understand that. What is Ashrei? And Paul Celan says about this word, it's a word without a meaning. We can give no meaning to that word now, but nevertheless, he uses the word. Ashrei can have no meaning, if only because there are no communities left who can say that word in public praise. It's not a word for individuals so much, it's a word more for the collective. And there are no communities left, there's no communal meaning left that can say Ashrei. So it becomes a very bitter word. It's a word that describes an unknown word, as he himself puts it, a word that for Germans will sound completely incomprehensible, will make them realize what it is not to understand the prevailing language, the prevailing language of the poem. It's a new music. And Filstener says, perhaps Ashrei contains in it a kind of pun on the word Ashrai, a scream. That is, instead of that state of created happiness, words creating happiness, we are left only with screaming words, with words that have failed to achieve anything like that. He makes another similar thing. What Celan says is that in this psaltery, in this Sefer Tehillim that we now have, we have the torn strings of a strident, discordant harp, right? Completely unstrung, untuned, and therefore nothing can sound as it's supposed to sound. And at the same time, the word remains. The Hebrew word is intact in the poem, as if to say, perhaps, that somewhere the word may preserve a communal bond. Even if it has no meaning, it exists as a word. And the time may come when we can begin hesitantly to become that word. So it's a way of both denying the word and affirming the word at the same time. It's a word that's a misfire, and yet it still remains as a marker in the place of total insecurity. And with this, I want to come to the last moment of what I'd like to express on this subject. Number 7 on your page. This is a famous story in the Talmud in Avodah Zarah. The punchline of the story comes right at the end, and we don't have time to read it through in great detail. The punchline is right at the end. It's a kind of aphorism. Yesh koneh olamo b'kama shanim, v'yesh koneh olamo b'sha'a achat. There are those who acquire their world. We'll see what that might mean. Who find themselves in the world, find a world over the course of many years' work. And there are those who do it in one instant, in one moment, in one brave moment. The story is about, I'll summarize it very briefly. It's a very powerful story. And it's one of a number of stories that illustrate that aphorism about a man called Elazar ben Durdeya, who was a very well-known profligate. Promiscuous isn't the word for him. He heard of a certain harlot who lived on the ends of the earth, far, far away, across the 7 rivers, who was supposed to be just excellent. And she took a very high price. We're given all these details. He fills his purse with gold coins. He crosses the 7 rivers. And when they are in the middle of the act, something she says, which I will not quote at this point, makes him immediately decide that he wants to do tshuva. What she says is, what she says is, you are the real thing. You are the real, my words fail me. You will never do tshuva. Your tshuva would never be expected. It would never be accepted. You are the real thing. And at that moment, paradoxically, he has a great desire to do tshuva. And then the Midrash narrates how he cries out to the mountains and the hills to ask for mercy for him, because he wants to have his tshuva accepted. And the mountains and the hills say, we have a hard enough time with ourselves. We're also part of the uncertain world, of the world of nature. We have to ask for our own welfare. We can't look after you. And then he asks the stars in the sky, the stars and the planets and the heavens and the earth, and everyone makes the same answer. No one will lift a finger for him. They can't help him. And in the end, he places his head between his knees in the fetal position, withdrawn into himself, in a way densely himself, And he says, I see that the thing depends on no one but me. And he he bellows, he cries in a bellow, like an animal bellow, till his soul flew away, till his soul left him. He had a kind of fit and he died. And then a heavenly voice came forth and said, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordea is welcome into the life of the world to come. So Rabbi Elazar ben Dordea suddenly gains entry in one moment, as it were, just because of extreme contrition and extreme desire, in which he almost, gives up the ghost. He almost commits suicide. He just gives his soul, lets his soul go. And at that moment, when this story is heard by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the author of the Mishnah, the leader of Jewry at that point in time, Rabbi weeps when he hears the story, the second last line in the Hebrew. He weeps and he says, he's someone else who weeps. The tzaddik also weeps. And he says, there are those who acquire their world over many years of hard work, who gain the world to come, you might say, in a very, whatever that means, who find their place in the world to come as a result of many years' work. And then there are those who do it in one instant. And I think it's clear that Rabbi weeps in outrage. It's outrageous. Why should one be able to gain one's world in one moment after a lifetime of flouting everything holy and everything good, in one moment of tshuva, when somewhere it shouldn't be like that. The rabbinical way of thinking certainly doesn't favor that. It favors the long, hard work, the work of many years. But this too is a reality. And this reality of the moment of becoming, the radical moment in which one can create a different world, is one that he has to accept. And not only that, this lout gets called Rabbi in the end. He's welcomed as Rabbi. I worked so many years to earn that honorific, to earn that title. And he just in one moment, he goes into his place and he's welcomed as a Rabbi. A lot of tension, a lot of force in this midrash. What I want to take this to now is the Sfatimet on the daughters of Slavhad, number 8. Yesh koneh olamo b'sha'a achat. He pulls that famous statement out of this midrash. There really are people who acquire their world in one moment. How do we understand that? He understands it not in the terms of the large story that we've just come from, but of a universal story. Everyone is like this. Everyone has this capacity. What is it? Kol adam yesh lo olam bifnei atzmo. The world that you can acquire is the world that is your world. Everyone, when you say acquiring your world, your part in the world, your share in the world to come, what you really mean is acknowledging the part that is yours. Everyone has their own world. My world is not your world in a very obvious way, right? My field of being is not yours. So everyone has a world. And he quotes his grandfather as then explaining the word olam, world, as he'alim. Now this is a real creative shift, a movement onto a different ground. What is a world? What is my individual personal world? It has to do with things being obscured from me. He'alem. Nit alma mimenu. Yeah. So the things that are hidden to me, that are obscure, that I don't understand. Hester. The things that block me in the world. The things that bring me up against a reality that in a way I can't use words to work my way around. I can't ignore them. These are things that stand against me in some way with hard edges. And that meaning of that is, he says, that every human being, not man or woman, has a certain form of blockage and resistance that meets her in the world, which she is there to deal with. Litzaken. That this is my particular story, my particular becoming when I have to deal with obstacles, when I have to deal with things that stand against me. And at the heart of this idea is the idea that it's not only the world above, in the world to come, that I have a special place. But if that is true, then it must mean that even in this world, there must be some experience in this world that was aimed straight at me. It's mine. That was the one that you were made for. And that always means for the Sfat Emet, some meeting up with resistance, something that threatens to take away your courage to say, I am, to use the other language, to do something about that resistance, to recreate the world in a sense and make it yours. What's called tikkun olam is tikkun ha'e'alim. It's repairing and fixing what at first was against you, what blocked you. And it's because of that, this worldly experience, that one has a share in the world to come. So it's this that is at stake here. That's what Benot Slavhad in the end stand for, the ability to do that. And with this, I want to move and to finish with another passage from the Sfat Emet, which is in number 11 on your page, which is really quite wonderful. And I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. What the Sfat Emet deals with here is the idea of v'ha'avarta. God says, the women have spoken well, you shall give them their share in the land, v'ha'avarta, and you shall transfer, the word is, you shall transfer to them the inheritance of the fathers. Now that word, laha'avir, idea somewhere of moving from one place to the other, of something slippery. You shall move land from one place to the other. In the Gemara in Baba Batra, this is background reading before we get to the Sfat Emet, says very powerfully that what women do is shehi ma'aberet et hanachala mishevet el shevet, that she moves the land, that she transfers the land from one tribe to another. Habat ma'aberet nachala mishevet leshevet. That is, as soon as you have a woman inheriting, that's the problem. That's why there was originally a block against it. What you have then is movable land. Land which is supposed to be the most solid and most certain and the most stable thing that exists, now becomes slippery because she marries someone who's not from her tribe and the land moves into another tribe. And all kinds of unwanted slippages happen. That's the problem with daughters inheriting. But as the Sfat Emet wants to say, that's also the good news, that women represent a certain kind of fluidity. Women represent possibility. They represent the unrigid way of recreating reality, of finding something one way and finding a way to move it into a different form, into a different way of being in the world. The Sfat Emet also points out that immediately after the story of Benot Slavhad, we have God telling Moshe, Ale el har ha'avarim, go up to this mountain of transits, of transitions. That's in verse 12 of the same chapter. Into this mountain of transitions and look out over the land from that transitional mountain. That is to move into a transitional place, into a place of transference, where things move from one state to another. And the Sfat Emet makes a great deal of this. Moshe is also told, both things he points out at the beginning, to lay his hands on Yeshua's head and transfer his leadership to Yeshua. So the notion that the Sfat Emet then conveys is this. quoting from a whole collage of sources. Moshe represents what's called here the male world. And women, of course, and Yeshua represents the female world. What does he mean by that? The male world is exemplified by the fact that Moshe's face was like the face of the sun, and Yeshua's face was like the face of the moon. You get a sense now of one epoch coming to an end and a new epoch starting with the next leader. What stands as the transitional place, the planes of transfer, of transmission between those two epochs, right, is the daughters of Slavhad. They are women, and as women, they have this slippage faculty. It's only women, and let me say it in his words here, he says. On the one hand, it's a kind of come down to move from the reality of Moshe to the reality of Yeshua. Moshe, who saw the light of God directly, and the word of God directly, to what he will call the oral law, the oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is, Yeshua begins that, which is derivative. It interprets what Moshe has given. At first, we might think it's really a great loss. We've moved downwards in the world, that when Moshe dies and doesn't go into the land, then we've lost that pristine access to the source of things, from the written Torah to the oral Torah. What is left now? Oral Torah, Yehoshua, which in Chazal, the sages, we were capable only of making drashot min haTorah. Their only creation is interpreting the text from the Torah. They can create all the Torah Sheba'al Peh based on a certain given text, but they need that basis to go on. Hotziu chachamim, they bring out, they draw forth the oral law. And that's why, that's what the Chachamim do when they create a smachtot. They lean their hands, as it were, on the given Torah, and they draw out of it the new interpretations. And that is the mode of the female. Now, male and female sounds very essentialist. Male and female, it's the female in this concept who receives from the male. That's a classic mythical concept. Physically, she receives and creates from the male. And that's why originally the sages said, it's really a shame and a disgrace that we had to move from Moshe to Yeshua, from the original thing to all the would-be interpretations, the interpretations that are capable of slipping all over the place. But really, in the last part, he really comes home and he says, this whole issue of the inheritance by women, Hanhala Labat, which is what happens to those who go into the land now, that will now be included in their way of doing things, is a physical expression of the time of Yehoshua, of the time of the female, the time of receptivity, which is deeply creative, the moonlit time rather than the sunlit time, the time in which there are lights and shadows. And that's why, and this is his brilliant stroke now, that's why this law was hidden from Moshe. The law of female inheritance, Moshe found himself stammering. He had nothing, he couldn't see it. Why couldn't he see it? Because it doesn't belong to his way of thinking, to his way of seeing. His world is not the world of daughters inheriting, that is, of the derivative, of the interpretive. It's the plain, clear, unambiguous world of God's speech and God's light. And in that sense, Moshe can't know that world, the world of interpretation. And for that reason, women know it. So that statement that we came across before, where God says to Moshe, the law that you don't know, women know, and that we assumed was a sarcasm about even women know it, and it's a way of putting Moshe down. The Sfatimet is now rereading that. He's reframing that. And he's saying, no, obviously Moshe can't deal with that issue of women inheriting, because that is the very essence of Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's how Torah Shabbat Peh works. It's oral presentations, oral reinterpretations, reframings of things, so as to create shifted realities, realities that seem in a way slippery, right? But sometimes that can be a good thing. New things can be born. And in that sense, of course, Moshe doesn't know it. And of course, the women do. No sarcasm involved at all. And in the end, then, what you have is a sense that Moshe is barred from crossing the Jordan, barred by the very fact that the whole reality across the Jordan is going to be one of daughters inheriting the world of Yehoshua, the world of oral law, and that rather extraordinary capacity to make Torah out of a different order of Torah, to take something that's given straight from God, as it were, and make it human and variable and slippery, able to slip into all kinds of nooks and crannies. And that's the place where Moshe climbs at the command of God before he dies, Har HaAvarim, the mountain in which things shift. It's the mountain of transmissions and transferences in which things that were literal can become metaphorical. Right? It's a place of movement. And in that place, Moshe doesn't recognize Nitzal Mamineni. He doesn't understand what he's seeing over there. However, I'd like to finish with this possibility. This is my own slippery suggestion. That if the Sfat Emet himself said in the previous passage that one's world really is a matter of how one confronts and stands one's ground in face of resistance, in face of things one doesn't understand and that don't yield easily to one, one finds ways of reframing, then perhaps we can say in a certain way, in the same terms, that when something evades, blocks Moshe, he doesn't know the law, right? That stands as a resistance to him. That is his way then of being challenged to make something ashrei out of that. That is how to come to recognize the beauty and the fitness of how things are for him and how things are for his children, for the next generation, and accept something about that crucial moment in which he stands at the top of the mountain. There are sources, in fact, that say that the moment of standing at the top of the mountain is the very moment in which he prays his great prayer to God, please let me cross over. Right? Let me get beyond this limit and let me cross over into the other side. He wants to penetrate this block in a kind of head-on fashion. And as you know, of course, he fails. It's a moment of failure where God says no. And facing that failure, and this is our subject next week, facing that failure, how does he make of that some kind of tikkun? How does he do something with that moment in a way that has to do with words, has to do with ways of speaking? He learns to speak. He learns to speak, and in such a way as to come to terms, and more than come to terms, with the moment of blockage. So what is failure and what is success have shifting meanings in the end. But that is next week's matter. And I wish you a very good week. And meantime, Shabbat Shalom.